it's very surprising how much contemporary artists are interested in Goya. But in a way, it seems that Goya's work, and especially Goya's graphic work, renovates. It has become a trope to say that he was the last of the old masters and the first really modern or contemporary artist. But in a way, this is true because of the universality of some of the powerful images he created. I wrote here in the first slide self-portrait he made in the 1790s. He was already very well-established artist working for the king. It's often said that if Goya had died before 1790, perhaps now he would be remembered as a, I wouldn't say mediocre artist, but just one more artist working at the court of Madrid. Nothing in particular. It is because the way he understood the times and the changes that were produced at that time in so many levels, whether it is political, social, intellectual, that he became the artist that he ended up being. Also because he lived for so long, he had the opportunity to see the drastic transformations. Just to consider that when he started, Spain was a very powerful empire, and at the time he died in France in 1828, the Spanish Empire had disappeared, vanished, and the world was completely changing only 10 years before the invention of photography. So in a way, his own life and work encompasses a century of transformations. That's one of the reasons why our own lives resonates with Goya's. So I brought here this self-portrait not only because it gives us an idea of how he saw himself at work, but also because this self-portrait contains an element that is very interesting, which is a piece of paper and some writing materials next to the canvas. Goya contracted a mysterious illness. We don't really know what happened in 1792, 1793. So he permanently became deaf, and this changed his art for sure, his biography, his activity, but there's something really important when it comes to his graphic activity. He had made some actions before, drawings, but writing and communicating through paper really became essential. And in a way, he became also an isolated witness of the Spanish society. And this is particularly relevant because he was at the right place at the right time, working for the king, for an absolute king, but very well connected with intellectuals and progressive, even politicians that at some point managed to be in the government. In other cases, were ostracized. So Goya was not really intellectual, but was surrounded by all the people that mattered in Spain. And he contributed to the humanitarian debate. I'm going to speak about that in just a few minutes, by his graphic work. More specifically by one of the series of prints he created, The Disasters of War. Traditionally, it was believed that his works, The Disasters of War, some of the drawings he produced, illustrated some of the ideas that were circulating at the time in enlightened or liberal circles. But now we even think that his was a contribution to develop and to go further with these ideas, because some of the messages he conveys and the images he created are actually very powerful political messages that have no correspondence or no explicit correspondence in writing at the time. We can see one of the earliest prints we know from Goya. It's known as the Garrote Man, and it's very striking because it's one of the first representations we know of a secular victim, perhaps a political victim of some kind. We don't know anything about this prisoner. He's going to be executed, but there's something very distinctive about the way Goya depicted this version. It's supposed to create empathy And also there are some striking details, such as the resemblance between these prisoner and religious figures, and obviously Jesus Christ. And this coincided with the debate on torture and the abolition of torture and the reformation of justice. A few decades later, he transformed these representations into openly political representations that fully illustrate some of the ideas that were being proposed at the time by legal theorists. I brought on the right an image of a prisoner. Goya's handwriting, you can see it there, said the security of a prisoner does not call for torture. So even if Goya was not an intellectual, he was fully aware of the humanitarian debate. And when the time came, and sadly, because of the Peninsular War, the Napoleonic invasion of Spain, that would happen in 1808, Goya was fully prepared to address and respond to the atrocities of war in a totally modern way. Before that, on the left is a Caprices series that Goya made in 1799. He was aware of the satirical prints that were made in Great Britain and other places, not in Spain. So he created this series of 80 prints, mostly for satirical purposes. We know that he had to withdraw these prints from the market, perhaps because of the pressure of the Inquisition. These prints are unique because of the finesse and the dexterity and the care with which he recreated all the details. He used the aquatine, which was not well known in Spain. So he was developing as a graphic artist as he was advancing at the court, because it was the year he was promoted to first court painter. After the failure, relatively, the Caprices, his graphic production stopped for a while, and he started making drawings for himself and a reduced circle of friends and artistic aficionados, which gave him some sort of liberty and freedom to address controversial issues such as prostitution or social criticism to the aristocracy. Some of the themes he had presented for the first time in the Caprices publicly, he would later develop them in his drawings. So just to give you some context, the French troops crossed Spain in order to capture Portugal, to invade Portugal. But at some point in 1808, they start settling in some Spanish garrisons, some Spanish fortresses. And at some point, it became only a matter of time that Spaniards and some Spanish politicians realized that Napoleon was actually invading Spain from within. The Spanish royal family was taken into captivity in France, and there was a massive rebellion in May 1808. So that was, in a way, the beginning of the Peninsular War. I'm not exaggerating if I say that the innovations, if we can call it that way, and that Napoleon brought to war strategy were as shocking for people in the early 19th century as nuclear war was in the mid-20th century. Before that, there was a concept of war as limited war. In many cases, civilians wouldn't even participate or notice confrontation. There were rules dictating what armies could be doing. All that collapsed because of Napoleon. You all know the term guerrilla that was born in Spain at this time. It meant small groups of civilian or irregular troops that would ambush or attack the French army. Because the French army would attack civilians because they didn't have a proper line of logistics, and they would rely on food or whatever they could find on the ground. Napoleon brought hundreds of thousands of conscripts to Spain. So there was a merciless war that had no precedent in modern time. And it was shocking. It was shocking. So it was only natural for someone as Goya with such a deep humanitarian sensitivity to make a representation of the war, but not from the point of view of war itself, but from the point of view of the victims. This is the main characteristics of the disasters. We're not going to find generals, we're not going to find battles, we're not going to see, it's impossible to trace the development of the Peninsular War just focusing or looking at the disasters. We don't know anything about that. There's only victim and victim. The war started in 1808 and it lasts until 1814. We know that Goya started working on this series around 1810. The time where he finished the disaster is not known because they were never published, and I will go back to that in a second. But it's very possible that he spent, he secluded himself, he isolated from the world, he had an excuse to do so because of his deafness. There's also a very crucial anecdote we know because of the letter Goya sent to the Secretary of the Royal Academy, is that at the beginning of the war, after the French had retreated from his hometown in Zaragoza, he moved to Zaragoza to see the effects of the war. Not to see the war, but to see the effects of the war. And that is going to be key, because if you look at the image on the left, which is the original title of the disasters of war, it's you can read fatal consequences of the bloody war in Spain against Bonaparte, against Napoleon. It's not war what he's depicting, it's the effects of the war, right? And that's the main characteristic of the disasters. So he, at some point, he produced, in privacy, for sure, a series of prints, as he had done before, 10 years before with the Caprichos, but now focusing on the brutality and the humanitarian consequences. Of course, there was scarcity of materials, shortage of materials he could use, plates that were available of a very, very bad quality. The same can be said about the varnish, and he would use plates of different sizes. Some plates in the series he cut in half other plates he had in his collection. So it was a very precarious process. These difficulties, he incorporated them visually into the images. And I think that is remarkable, and we will be discussing some of the images themselves, and you can see what I mean by these. So on the right, you can see one of the most famous disasters of war, and there is no help, y no hay remedio. I'm reading the caption, and I hesitate to call it a caption because we may associate the caption with a description, and this is not what Goya's captions are. It's not a caption, but a message in every single one of these plates. They are addressing someone else, which is the spectator, the viewer. We know them because we have a bound set of working proofs in the collection of the British Museum that belong to Goya and that Goya sent to a friend with titles, complete titles. And the narrator itself is looking at the image, but it's not inside the image. It's a different voice, which is really interesting. I'm not the first one to compare Goya to a photojournalist or a reporter or a chronicler. But in a way, he's not trying to present facts in a neutral way. He's pointing at facts. He's provoking an emotional response. And so, for instance, in this image, and there's no help, it's clear what he's trying to do with the viewer, right? Is to make, oh, there's nothing. This is a helpless person. You know what is going to happen now. There are 82 prints, produced in different stages. As the war developed, he changed things. So, for instance, the first plates were devoted to the war scenes. Spanish people fighting French people, war reprisals, women being attacked by soldiers or fighting soldiers, people disposing of bodies. Then there's a second section, usually known as the Famine of Madrid. Well, Goya was in Madrid after he returned from Zaragoza. The city was controlled by the French, and there was a food shortage. People dying in droves in the streets, and Goya saw that. They are not documents, literally, although some events sounds really credible. We have a working proof, for instance, in Boston Museum of Fine Art, in which Goya referred to on the back of the working proof saying, El de Chinchón, so the person I saw in this small town. So what is more important is that he's trying to make images that are organically connected to reality. Of course, Goya couldn't know photography as a tool because it wasn't invented yet, but he could emulate the effect of seeing something real. And he would do that with graphic interventions. The image on the right, you can see one of them. You can see the ripples on the right of the image. The frame of the image is very abrupt. It's creating the illusion that the pictorial field is incomplete, that is circumstantial, that is casual, that you are in this place seeing the events, that the image hasn't been prepared for you artistically, but that you're seeing the raw reality, raw, unadulterated, unprepared reality. If we move to the sixth slide, you can see two images of women. Why was Goya so interested in women and the role of women during the war? For several reasons, because obviously they were not soldiers, and that was one of the Goya's main intentions, to represent war from the point of view of the victim. On the image on the left, there's a woman attacking a group of French people. Goya is praising them, their bravery. They are like wild beasts. That's the title of this plate. And on the right, there's a woman with her baby, and another woman that is resistant. The French soldier is trying to attack her, and how Goya framed that is seen within an arch, perhaps to suggest they are about to fall. And this is very typical of Goya in the disasters, that his artistic decisions, the compositions, and the visual elements in the representations are deeply connected. So if we move to slide number 7, we can get a glimpse of Goya's creative process. It's strange that as a painter, we don't have many preliminary drawings. We don't have much information about how he proceeded, what would be the first step. We suppose he would use drawings. But in his activity as an etcher and as a printmaker, it's essential. And we are very lucky that we preserve many of the preliminary drawings he used for all his series of prints. Most of them are at the Prado Museum. But he would never reproduce a preliminary drawing in a mechanical way. He will always rethink the image, transform the image, and add something else, depending on the effect he wanted to create in every specific image. In this slide, I brought 2 preliminary drawings that are related to the same theme. In these cases, we know that Goya copied manually the preliminary drawing that he had created into the ground of the plate. That's why the drawing is in reverse. In some cases, he would just put the preliminary drawing in red chalk through the press, and then he would proceed to, using as a reference the preliminary drawing, he would make the final composition. And there's another very powerful connection between drawing and the disasters of war and other prints by Goya, but specifically the disasters of war. You can see there's a higher degree of spontaneity in his drawing. And perhaps Goya wasn't making this for anyone or for any audience. He loved etching. He really opposed academic printmaking and academic drawing with this use of regular hatching. For him, etching was very similar to drawing. In different working proofs, we can see his creative process, how free he was. He would use, for instance, subtractive methods. He would use the scraper and the varnisher all the time to modify images and also to create halftones and highlights. He would use anything at hand. The same thing he would do with his paintings, he would do with his prints. He would alter the images for expressive purposes or for compositional purposes. He employed burring, dry points, aqua tint. We saw before in the Caprichos was a very bad quality. Nevertheless, he used it in the disasters of war. It was a very coarse grain. But it seems that at some point in certain compositions, he liked that because of their raw character. He never fought against that. He incorporated that vibrancy and that irregularity of the material context in which he was working into the composition. This image is very striking because It allows me to introduce a theme that has to do with what I said before about Goya being perhaps one of the first photojournalists. We can call him a photographer, but he had a very natural intuition of time, as he had a very natural intuition of space. Early on, I made a reference to the frame, how he used intentionally the visual frame to evoke the idea of the natural vision. So you are in the same spot as where the scene is taking place. The artistic image is not being created for you. You are watching something that is real. So the same thing applies to time. Do you know there were many artistic conventions in our history about the representation of time? Images could be repeated, for instance, or simultaneously represented things that were sequential. You can see on the left of the image two prisoners that have been hanged, and they are literally swinging. And Goya has captured these two figures as if frozen in time. I can imagine how strange this depiction must have been at the time. So Goya is not giving you a static image that is very easy to understand, very intelligible. Is always trying to give you an idea that the event is happening right now. So we move to slide number 8 and see another very well-known composition in the disasters. It's called One Can Look. The title is really fantastic because I think it's also evoking the role of the position of the witness. It belongs to the series devoted to victims. This is a group of civilians, perhaps in the cave, perhaps they have been hiding in the countryside and they have been discovered by French troops, and they are most likely, they are going to be executed. No one is looking at the firing squad. Perhaps Goya did this or organized the image in this way to emphasize that they are civilians. They are not even visually engaging with the captors, perhaps, of the soldiers that are going to attack them. You are the one who have been given the privilege of looking. And this is exactly what witnessing is. But it's a politicized. You are looking something that you are not allowed to see. I really like this image because if you see behind, Goya used the varnisher to create a sort of an arrow, if you can see, on the right, next to the head of the victim that is turning his back to the firing squad. It's a sort of finger that Goya introduces visually, the composition, that is supposed to create a force that is both anticipating what is going to happen, like the force of the volley of shots that is going to start in a few seconds, but also is pointing out the images at the center of the composition. So he's focusing on the victims, on the people themselves. So this is another example in which, through the use of shade and light and line and the composition and the frame, he is giving you one message. Look at this. And he's doing that by negating the very possibility of looking. No se puede mirar. One can't look. The image on the right, disasters number 29, is very peculiar because, along with another plate in the series, and perhaps one drawing connected to the series, it communicates what is unique and very modern about Goya's humanitarian point of view. He is very Spanish. He's a patriot, although he is a liberal and he knows that the French invaders brought some things that were good for the renovation of the Spanish political system. He condemned brutality of people attacking French soldiers and also collaborators. So he wasn't simply pro-Spanish, he was against the war. So that's why the disasters of war are not just about the Spanish people rebelling against French people. These are only the circumstances that allow Goya to reflect on war itself. So he has some sort of neutral view of war, which reflect the discussions about human rights or natural rights. They are above any circumstance. And if you look at the title, The Merecía, he deserved it, he's speaking with irony, like he deserved it. Like, yes, he is denouncing these wanton and brutal attacks that sometimes civilians would make on French collaborators or soldiers as part of guerrilla groups. If we move to the next slide, in the catalog of the exhibition, I refer to this image on the left. particularly as the equivalent to Picasso's Guernica in the 19th century. Because this is probably one of the first representations we have of a bombing. This is a house, a family house somewhere that has been attacked. And again, this Goya's perception of time as a slice of time. We are seeing the house collapsing as it happens. The chaos of the composition, the confusion, it really emphasizes that this whole structure is collapsing, right? And you can see the mother that was feeding her baby just a few seconds ago, and life has been brutally interrupted. It's not a coincidence that he placed that figure right on the vertical axis to emphasize gravity, like the effect of a body falling, and the armchair on the upper right, perhaps to stress the was normal domestic life vanishing in just a fraction of a second. There's an interest in the disaster, not just for representing the material and the human consequences of the war, but also the social consequences of the war. This title is very eloquent. Everything is topsy-turvy. You see some clerics and priests, monks, that they didn't know where to go. The French secularized convents. Goya is not only interested in death and the brutality of the war, but also the social consequences. He was aware that the world was rapidly changing, and nobody knew the direction society was taking. So many wars were fought at this time simultaneously. Obviously, the war against the French, but also liberalism against absolutism, and not all the sides were aligned in all issues. So that's why, even if the war ended in 1814, repression and political violence lasted in Spain for at least more than a decade after that. In slide number 10, I brought two images that illustrate famine and death. There's no combats here, no violence, it's only hunger. It's very remarkable how he translated, using the very few instruments he had at hand, graphic instruments, how he conveyed the solitude of dying by hunger, the desperation. How can you translate that emotion? For instance, in the image on the right, we are very aware of desperation of that figure, surrounded by people just laying around because they can't even stand because of the hunger. And this figure is realizing that he's alone and nobody can save him. And how Goya has reinforced that feeling by isolating this figure. He's placed right at the center of the image. He's surrounded by this strange cloud of light. How with the burnisher, the Goya created this effect, the hallucinatory effects of hunger, but above all, desperation. How he translated the idea manifested in the title, there's no one to help them, of dying on your own, how he translated that visually, using only this striking effect between light and shade, and this effect of this halo almost of emptiness surrounding the main figure. And on the left, there's a representation of a morgue, perhaps not even that, a place where they were storing bodies, people dying in Madrid, literally in the streets. They were just robbed and placed there, waiting for their turn to be taken to the cemetery. It's very remarkable how the first war painter, as Goya was, would take his time to depict this and create such a moving image, such an artistic quality. But you can see here the images I've been discussing, which is just small representations because there are 82 of them and more because there are some other works that are connected with the series. The variety of themes he was discussing. It says a lot about how, with which granularity he would investigate the human consequences of the war. It's not simply a generic representation of victimhood, but also the many manifestations, terrible manifestations of war and in people and in society. Just think that Goya's contemporaries would be depicting battles, very often from bird-eyes view. So you would see tiny figures. He enlarged the scale so you could see the faces, and he could create more moving and expressive representations. In slide number 11, I brought this image along with its preliminary drawing. So you can see first another example of how Goya transformed the images, the drawings, the compositions he made in drawing when he made the final version on print. You can see that on the right, this seems like a door, something like that. There's a figure placing the body on the ground that in the final image on the right has become two people carrying the body, and a strange arc, pathway of some sort. Why did Goya introduce that element there? We don't know, of course. It's possibly just an aesthetic decision, but it also echoes the shape of the body of the victim on the left, and certainly it increases this perception of falling, of gravity, of weight. And the same can be said of the line you see right on the middle of the image, just crossing through the head of the man that is carrying this woman. It makes everything more heavy, and you participate of this sensation of falling down, the body, the inert weight of the victim. It's very interesting that some scholars have noticed how this motif of the falling arm had been employed in religious art for centuries, especially the Flemish religious painting that had been used in Spain in the 15th and 16th century for the representation of Christ. So perhaps Goya wanted to activate, that intuitive religious instinct. When you see an image like that, it immediately makes you think of saints and martyrs and Christ himself. So this is a secular thing of victimhood, but he wanted to endow these images with this sense of dignity. The dignity they didn't have in life because they were discarded. He wanted to give that sense of dignity, at least in representation. So in slide number 12, this is a representation of one of these prints I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation that are connected to the disasters of war and belong to the disasters of war, but in an indirect way, they reflect what, the consequences of war. I said at the beginning that Goya was drawing a lot. He wouldn't make series or cycles of drawings, but he would make albums, collections of drawings that would be revolving around the same topics, roughly, using normally the same techniques. And you can see some correspondences between the prints that were made at the time and drawings. On the left, I brought one drawing from Goya's album C, which is contemporary to the disasters. And on the right, one plate from the disasters against the comet bird. So perhaps he might be referring here to the absolutist forces or perhaps the church that were in favor of the return of absolutism. For Goya, it was impossible to detach war from the political context. And again, there's been this wonderful book about Goya and Clausewitz, Prussian theories of the war, the Napoleonic way of war, said the war is a continuation of politics with different means. And of Goya and the disasters of war, we can say that for him, politics were the continuation, if not of war, at least of violence and repression. Again, on the left, in slide number 13, we can see another piece, drawings. It says, por liberal. It means for being a liberal. And Goya is asking himself, is this woman being punished just for being a liberal? Just for being pro-constitution or pro-parliamentary system? Obviously, the answer is yes, because there was a lot of repression right after the end of the Peninsular War. But I want you to pay attention to this female figure. Goya used the body of the woman as a scenario of brutal violence, to denounce violence, but he also used the body of the woman as a representation of high ideals and high value. Goya was formally trained, he was a man of his century, he knew very well allegories and symbols any painter would use, but these symbols were not credible, had been frozen in time, as it were. Goya would naturalize these symbols to convey ideas such as truth or liberty or justice and perhaps even constitution. So the woman became both a symbol of high ideals and liberation and liberty, and at the same time passive representations of brutal power. So if we move to slide number 14, you can see how this applies to the disasters. These are two very strange images that are unique in the disasters of war, in the last section of the disasters of war, known as the striking caprices, caprichos emphaticos. This is the title that was in Goya's own copy of the disasters. We don't know what really meant by that. Capricho meant fantasy, folly. This is obviously an allegorical representation of what happened right after the war, or perhaps even during the war. You can see the title is Truth Has Died, and the enemies of truth are ready to bury her. She's a shining figure, even if she's dead. And you can see on the left, there's a monk with a shovel. There's a bishop, perhaps, some people surrounding her, blinded by the light. Her body is still emanating. And on the right, the continuation, although it's not technically a sequence because the figures have changed. You can see some monsters. Goya recreates this feeling of darkness, visual darkness, but also moral darkness. The body of truth is resuscitated. She's rising again. Title presents the scene as perhaps an hypothetical situation. Will she rise again? And this is connected to the uncertainty and political conflict of the moments leading to the end of the war in Spain, where French abandoned the country, but political violence and political confrontation remain because of the civil war. So we move to slide number 15, and belonging to this final section of the disasters, we can see an image on the left that is very interesting. And the title says nothing. I told you at the beginning that there was no edition of the disasters. Disasters were not published for many reasons. Some scholars believe it's because Goya didn't saw the market for it after years of war. It's very likely. Also because of the political situation right after the war ended. The disasters of war contain a lot of representations of people in arms fighting against a tyrant, Napoleon Bonaparte. And of course, King Ferdinand, an absolute king, didn't like very much the idea of people rebelling against the tyrant, right? In 1863, when there was a different situation and the Royal Academy was able to acquire the plates from a person who had bought the plates from Goya's grandson, they restored some of the plates that had deteriorated, and they engraved the titles that were contained in the set that is now in the British Museum. But in very few cases, they made changes, such as in this one. You can see this, I'm showing you Goya's own impression. It says, nada, ello lo dice. I would translate this image as, there's nothing. And this thing is telling you, right? Whereas in the final version, the official version of the disaster, the title was changed to nothing. The event will tell you, implying that there's an afterlife. We don't know what was Goya's intention. Perhaps he's a comment about the futility of the effort. Like, imagine 6 years fighting against French, and when everything is over, you find more repression, more violence, and you have to flee. We know that he worked on this image for a long time, and he transformed the original composition. It's very difficult to see, but on the left side of the image, you can barely spot the scales of justice. Initially, this was going to be a symbol of justice next to the skeleton. And of course, one of the reasons why the disasters of war were not very popular throughout the 19th century among conservative circles was because of images like this one on the right, made the court break. Interestingly enough, in the preliminary drawing, the priest that is walking on the tightrope is not a priest, but the Pope. So he saw the church as an essential element to protect the status quo of violence and repression. This time, the Inquisition that had been abolished by the Spanish Constitution still existed and was reestablished. So some figure on the bottom right is even pointing to the rope, saying, wow, it's about to break forward. Something is going to happen here. As it happened a few years later, when there was a brief liberal interlude of 3 years, after which, when absolutism was reestablished again, Goya had to leave his home in Madrid. All the copper plates, all the preliminary drawings, and more than 400 working proofs of the disaster he had created. We only have 2 complete sets. And it's because of this that we still have this collection of prints, perhaps the most powerful anti-war manifesto ever created. the perception, the appreciation of the disasters change as democracies will establish and as photojournalism took off. More and more people start paying attention to the connections between Goya's interpretation of war and photojournalism. And I wrote one very telling image. On the left, you can see one of the most famous disasters of war. I saw it, Yolobi, and one image. This is a migrant family, I think it's Texas border. And I'm not suggesting a formal similarity. Of course, this is not what is important. It's the capacity of Goya to capture the universal elements of victim and human suffering. The caption here is probably the most important one in the whole series. Geology. I saw it. Goya was able to speak through his images, to present himself in first person, because who is speaking here? The narrator is not contained in the image. You know, it's Goya himself who is saying, I saw this, I can tell you this was true. You can see civilians fleeing, perhaps from the incoming French army. We know anything about the details. And Goya didn't want us to know that, because that would undermine the universality. We only see a priest fleeing, some families there carrying their belongings. We see that the enemy is incoming because of these terrorized children and the mother hurrying him and taking her baby on her back to run away. This is an example of why so many contemporary artists still look at Goya, the same as in 1937 during the hardest times of the Spanish Civil War. They went back to Goya. They re-edited the disaster because they thought it was the most powerful artistic manifesto, a universal manifesto against war that could symbolize not only the suffering of people in times of Goya, but also of people in any period and in any human situation.